Okay, so thank you all for joining September's webinar, all about how to get the most out of your sales meetings. So obviously, when we go out to meet with our customers, we don't want to waste their time. We certainly don't want to waste our time. We've got a lot to achieve in any one day. So we want to make sure that we get the most out of our meetings when we go. So we are going to talk about our meeting objectives. What is it that you need to know, right? So through the entire process, what are you trying to find out? How are you going to find that out via questioning? How are you going to make sure that you listen attentively and actively so that you get all that information out of it? And then we'll just touch on handling objections at the end. Obviously, you don't want to have objections, but they will sometimes come out. And they can cause an issue if they're not handled properly within the confines of the meeting. So it is important that we handle them correctly. Okay, so our meeting objectives then. Really important that when we go into our meeting, we know what it is that we want to get out of the meeting. Why are we having the meeting? If we don't have an objective, it's pointless having the meeting. So if we think about where we are in the sales process, well, pretty much most of our meetings are in the validation stage here. So our customer research and needs analysis tend to be before we ever get to meet the customer, we understand what it is that they do, what it is that they might need our product for. But then we have to validate that. We have to make sure that the customer is going to be able to say yes to our proposal. And we'll no doubt have meetings through the proposal, presentation, and negotiation stages. But they are generally less of them, or hopefully there are less of them than there are around the validation stage. So our validation stage is when most of those meetings happen. And there can be quite a lot, depending on what it is that we are trying to sell and how long our sales process takes. We can go through a large number of them. And if we think about our whole sales process, what we're trying to do at every stage is to sell the next stage of the process. So what's the next step? What is the next thing that we want to do? And whilst our validation stage is just one step in that process, because there's so many meetings that will happen in there, we've got to think at every stage, what's the next thing that we want to have happen, so that we make sure that we ask for that before the end of that meeting. So we're going to go into our meeting with a primary objective. What is it that we want to get out of this meeting? What do we need to tell the customer? What do we need to hear from the customer? And what are we going to ask for at the end so that we can move on to the next stage? I mean, it's also important to then have a fallback position if you can't achieve your primary objective. So if you're not going to be able to get that thing that is most critical to you, what's the next best thing that you can ask for? Okay. So, for example, when we go into our meetings, we may have some objectives. Obviously, our ultimate aim is to get a purchase order, right? But that might not be the thing that we get to ask for straight away. We might, for example, want to be introduced to the economic buyer. Okay, so obviously their views are going to be important in this whole process. How do we get to listen to them? We really want to meet with them, and it would be great if our main contact could introduce us to them. So that might be one of our objectives. It may be as simple as we need to make a presentation to you. We need to give you additional information that help you to understand what it is that we're going to be able to do for you. So can we have agreement to that? We might want to meet with a different group of users. So we may be talking to a small group now, or one particular group of users. We may realize that our products are going to get used by others, so we need to meet with them. We might have a meeting just to review the proposal or review what we think is going to go into the proposal. It can be good enough to have a meeting to maintain the good relationship, right? So particularly when your customer is an ongoing customer, they are buying things from you on a regular basis. It is important that you continue that. And so you might have a meeting just to update things. And that can be a valid reason to have. I wouldn't be doing that all the time. You do want to be trying to move things through the process. But having a meeting every so often to understand how things are changing on both sides is important. Particularly at this time of year, you might be wanting to understand the budget setting process. So people are setting budgets for next year. How is that work process going to work? Is there going to be any money allocated to the area where you're working? Or finally, you might want to see if there's any competition to the product that you're selling. Are they talking to others? What else are they doing? What are their objectives around those areas? So they're just some examples of the objectives that you might have for your meeting. You'd need to, as I say, you need to be sure that you know what it is that you're going into that meeting for, so that you're not wasting your time or your customer's time. Particularly your customer, because they will realize that if you're wasting your time, and they'll be less likely to have a meeting with you in the future. Okay. So in all of the meetings that we go into, we are generally wanting to find information. We are wanting to get to the next stage of the entire sales process, which is to write a proposal. And in order to write a proposal, there's various things that we need to know. And they are very neatly summarized with the mnemonic of Scotsman. So that stands for solution, competition, originality, timeline, size, money, authority, and needs. Now, they are listed in that order because that's how you spell Scotsman. They're not generally listed in the order in which you might ask for that information. So you would probably start by understanding their needs, because that ultimately will tell you whether or not there's an opportunity for you or not. Only later in the process might you ask, have they got budget and who's going to sign off on this? So as I say, it's not the order in which you will ask for things. It's the order in which you will remember all of the things that you have to ask and understand. Okay, so we'll just go through each of them fairly quickly. Right, so the solution, what is your solution to the customer? What are you actually going to sell them? And you might think, well, that's blindingly obvious, but actually it's not always. There may be a combination of products, there may be some products and services, the numbers that are involved, you need to understand all of those things. So whilst we would love it to be easy, sometimes they are going to be a little bit more complicated, and you need to understand all of those things. So the competition, who are the competition? What do they offer? How good is their offer? All right. So what are you up against? If you don't know that, you may struggle to make a competitive offer, particularly if your products are similar or are perceived as being similar. They might not even be that similar. You may just be looking or trying to win the same products from the same budget. So, for example, if you're selling computer software, it may be that all computer software gets bought out of the IT budget. And so your competition might not be a product that does what you do, but it might be a product that does something entirely different, but it's a computer software program, and therefore it competes for the budget with you. And so you need to understand those things as well. So it may be a direct competition in terms of functionality against functionality, but it might just be competition for budget. If you are competing on a functionality basis, right, you need to understand what's unique about what you do, right? How are you different from anyone else? Because at the end of the day, if two products do exactly the same thing, the chances are they're going to go and compete on price. So you have to go and find what are the pieces that are unique about what you do. And it doesn't have to be the entire product that has to be unique, but there has to be some elements to it that's unique. And they're the things that will persuade the customer to buy your product over someone else's. So you need to accentuate what's original and unique about you and downplay what is unique about your competition, because obviously they will be doing exactly the same thing. They'll be trying to highlight what's important to them or important about their product. Okay, the timeline. When does the customer need the product? Right? When are they actually going to use it? How long is it going to take to deliver it? Right? So if they need it tomorrow and you can't deliver it till next week, that's going to be a problem. Right? Whereas if they only need it next week and you can deliver it tomorrow, that's all straightforward. Right? But that timeline is important to understand, partly because obviously you'll be asked for a forecast of when it is that you're going to go and deliver the revenue to your company. but you've got to make sure that it fits with the needs of the customer. What's the size? How much are you actually going to sell them, right? How many widgets is it going to be? How big is the project that it's going to be? All right. Again, you need to understand that, because that's going to drive how big the deal is for you. And therefore, it's also going to drive the next stage, which is the money, right? What's it all going to cost? Is that profitable for you? Can the customer afford to pay, right? Is there a balance that has to be taken? So whilst you would like to ask for a lot of money, it may be that you have to, in a first prod sale or whatever, you might ask for less in order to get beyond that stage or whatever. But you've got to be able to balance what's it going to cost you, what you're going to charge to the customer, and what can the customer afford to pay. And then who's going to approve the purchase? Who is the person who actually holds the budget? Who's going to sign off on it such that you can move forwards with it? All right. And then, as I say, the last thing in the list, simply because it's the last thing, the letter in the Scotsman, but really the first thing that you need to understand is, what does your customer need, right? What are they trying to achieve? What's stopping them achieving it? And that then obviously drives your solution, which is what it is that you're going to deliver to the customer. So that's the first thing you really need to understand. What does your customer need? Okay. Any thoughts, questions, comments about any of that? It should hopefully be fairly obvious to anyone, or to everyone who's working in sales. You may well have seen the Scotsman before. It's just a good reminder of what it is that you need to be finding out as you go through the process. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We are going to ask questions. Okay, so the thing about questions, and particularly answers, is that if you want to practice them, you actually have to have someone to practice them with. So it's always good to go and find someone that you can do that with. And if you're going into a meeting that's particularly important, I would suggest trying to role play it with one of your colleagues in advance. Try to think through what questions you're going to ask, what answers might come back, and therefore what secondary questions you might want to ask as a result, so that you have them planned. So it's like, here's the things I need to know, therefore these are the questions that I'm going to ask, so that you have them prepared. I think the more that you can do that, the better, because then you'll get the more out of the meeting as a result. Okay. So it's often said that successful people ask better questions and therefore get better answers. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you go and ask better questions. But before we do, I saw that as a great question on LinkedIn a while ago. And that question was, when you go into a sales meeting, do you drink your coffee hot or cold? Anyone like to proffer an answer as to what they do or what they think they should do?
I honestly don't drink. But I have a choice. I would choose hot.
You would drink it hot, yes.
I would drink hot.
That's right. Okay. So if you drink it cold, it's because you've probably been talking too much and you haven't been able to drink your drink. If you drink it hot, you're listening, and that's the better thing, right? So you should be drinking your drink hot. It's just a good way of remembering it. So when you go in, you want to get your customer talking most, particularly at the start of the meeting, right? Get them talking, and then you can talk afterwards. There's a really good article in the Harvard Business Review, which is called "The Surprising Power of Questions." I will send you the slides afterwards, so you can get that link. People always want to be asked more questions, right? If you go on a date with somebody, if all you ever do is talk about yourself, that other person is going to walk away and say, I've no desire to meet that person again. All they do is talk about themselves. You want to be asking more questions. So the more questions you ask, the better the whole thing is going to be. Okay. And I say this research goes back a long time. When people have conversations, there's two main objectives: information learning and impression management, right? And asking questions achieves both, right? So obviously, if you ask a question, you get information back. That's an obvious thing, but actually it implies that you're interested in the other person, and so you form a positive impression. And so people who ask more questions are going to be better liked by their conversation partners, learn more about their partners, be able to correctly guess their partner's preferences, and are more likely to go on a second date as a result. Obviously, we're not looking for a second date, but we are looking for another meeting. And so we want to, again, ask more questions so that we can achieve those things. The first step to actually becoming a better questioner is simply to ask more questions. Not necessarily that you ask better questions, but actually ask more questions. So it may seem like a strange thing to do, but the more questions you ask, the better it's going to be. Over time, you can start to ask better questions, but simply starting by asking more is a good place to start. Okay, and there are 4 basic types of questions. So introductory questions such as how are you? Mirror questions which flip that question back, so I'm fine, how are you? Full switch questions which change the topic entirely, and then follow-up questions which get more information. So we'll ask a question, what did you do at the weekend? Someone won't answer. You then ask them for more information about what they actually did. And those questions are really, really powerful because they say to that other person that you're listening, you've listened to their answer, you want to know more, and therefore you care more about them. They also tend to elicit more information because people will then think about what it is that they did or what it is that you're asking about, and they will just answer naturally, and they're not sort of pre-prepared answers. So if you watch a lot of politicians, when they get asked questions, they have pre-prepared answers. They've thought about that question. What they haven't necessarily always done is thought about the follow-up questions that come. And so they tend to end up repeating the answer that they gave the first time, right? Which maybe works for a politician, but when you're trying to get information out of a customer, that's not what you want. So you want to be asking original follow-up questions to get to that point. Okay. The other thing to do is to think about the order in which you ask those questions. So if you go up to somebody and say, what's the biggest regret in your life? Right, that's a really big question. It really makes you think, and it actually can be quite off-putting for the person that you're asking. Whereas if you ask them, what are the things that you've done? What did you do well? What didn't you do well? What would you do differently? And then ask, well, what was your biggest regret? It's much easier for them to answer it because you've led them to that point. And people start to like you more as a result when you ask questions in that way. So starting with easy questions that they can answer, sometimes really simple yes, no questions or whatever will work in that instance, but asking simple questions and then getting more complicated as you go along result in better answers. When we start to talk to our customers, we really want to try and get them to talk and open up. And so we really need to ask what we call open questions. And open questions start with who, what, when, where, how, why, and they can't be answered yes or no. Right? If you've ever played the yes/no game with people, you will see that it's if you only get back answers yes or no, it's really hard work because you've got to think of another question really quickly, and you don't have much information to play with in order to ask a follow-up question. Whereas if you ask an open question, you'll get a whole bunch of information, and then you can start to drill down on that and find out more information about all the various parts. So as I say, closed questions can be answered yes or no, and they gain you the least information. You can use them towards the end of your questioning sequence, and sometimes you will want to ask those because you will want to say, have you got the budget? Are you the decision maker? Is the proposal acceptable? Right? There are times when you want yes or no answers, but at the start of the sequence, you really want to be thinking about getting as much information as you can, right? So in terms of how you ask that question, there's a variety of ways you can ask the same question, one of which is closed and one of which is open. So for example, you could ask the question, will the budget affect your business? That's a closed question. People may well open up and give you more information than just a yes or a no answer, but they probably won't give as much information as if you ask, how will the budget affect your business? Because at that point, you then get them to think about it and they'll give you more information as a result. Okay. As I say, closed questions can be useful when we want somebody to make a decision, but they can also be very useful if we want to change someone's mind. So we ask short, easy questions that can be answered yes or no, if it's appropriate, right? And they're a good way of getting people to change their mind, because actually they don't stop and think about the answer so quickly, so much. Whereas obviously when you ask an open question, you tend to think about your answer a lot more. If you are going to go through that questioning way, it's much more important. It's probably important to think about it in advance, because thinking through that sequence, what questions do we need to ask in order to do that, make that change, can be quite difficult on the hoof as you go along. Okay, and then just the last type of questions that we want to talk about are funnel questions. So when we ask our open question at the start, so how will the budget affect your business, for example, there may be a wealth of information that comes out. And so what we want to do is take all that information and then just focus in on some of it. Okay, find out all you can about that part and then go back and say, okay, there was something else we talked about. Let's focus in on that and understand those. And that it's a technique that people like detectives will use when taking a statement from a witness, for example. So they might say how many people were involved in the fight. Okay, it was about 10. Were they all children or adults? Right, mostly children. What sort of ages were they? About 14 or 15. So we've gone from how many people to what age these people were. Were any of them wearing anything distinctive? Okay, yes, several of them had red baseball caps on. Right, can you remember if there was a logo on any of the caps? Now I come to mention it. Yes, I remember seeing the big letter N. So we've gone from this very broad, how many people are involved in the fight, to a number of them were wearing baseball caps with the red letter N on. And that's a very focused piece of information. We might then go back and say, okay, well, were there some adults there? Okay, well, what about the adults? What was different about that? What were they wearing? Were they doing anything different? Were they really involved, or what was going on? And so we'll ask a different set of questions around that information. So as I say, we go down through the funnel, get as much information you can about one part of it, and then go back and ask about the rest of it, so that you understand as much as you can by the end of that questioning process. Okay, any questions or comments about questioning? Okay, so we'll move on to active listening. Okay, so it's very interesting that the word silent has the same letters in it as the word listen. So when you're listening, you really should be silent. But the point about active listening is that it's not just hearing, it's actually doing more than that. So hearing is accidental, involuntary, and effortless. So there is noise going on around us all the time, and we are hearing all of that. Listening is focused, voluntary, and intentional. So we are specifically choosing to hear what it is that the customer is saying in our instance, rather than anything else that's going on around us. So just to sort of talk about the distinction between those things, this is a map of all the flight paths around Heathrow Airport. And my wife used to live exactly where that black dot is. And it's directly under one of the flight paths in. And so regularly you could walk out of the house and there'd be a 747 slowly flying over your head on the way into Heathrow Airport. And obviously it makes a lot of noise. and they were going in about every minute or so. So when you first sort of live there, you kind of realize that, oh, there's a lot of noise, and you hear it all the time. But over time, your brain actually tunes it out, and you don't hear it so much anymore. You might hear it if it's very distinctive, or it's different, or it's particularly low, or whatever. But you actually tune out most of that noise, and you don't actually hear it. Okay, so then in that instance, we're not listening. We might hear it, but our brain is not registering it, and we don't notice it anything like as much. Obviously, that's the complete opposite of what we want to be doing when we're in a meeting with a customer. We want to hear everything that they have to say, but we also want to hear everything that they communicate, okay? So a lot of our communication is actually non-verbal. So it's the way we sit, the way we speak, and all the things that come across, as well as just the words. We've also got to remember that we only actually remember probably less than half of what we hear. So again, the customer will say an awful lot. We've got to try and process that and work out what it is that they're saying. Is there an underlying message? What else can I pick up from what it is that they're saying? Okay, so listening is difficult, right? So there's other noises going on. There's your own thoughts that are going on as well. So people are saying something and it might trigger some thoughts in your head about other things. There's the way you're feeling, and there's also the words that they use. So there may be confusion over words. They may use an expression you don't understand. It's always one of the things I say when you're in sales is that you should never, ever use language that your customer might not understand. Don't use internal vocabulary. Don't use shortcuts or abbreviations, right? So that your customer fully understands what it is that you're saying, okay? Our attention span isn't fantastic, particularly in a world where so much information is being thrown at us all the time. Our attention span appears to be getting less and less. And so we may, if a customer answers a question for 5 minutes, that's an awful lot of time that we're listening and trying to understand. We have our own biases that actually make us view the information that's coming back in a certain way. We may just reject that information. We may choose to go reinforce what we mean or what we believe. But it makes a difference to what we actually hear. And then our own sort of feelings are in there as well. Okay. So active listening then is where we make a conscious effort to hear not only what the person is saying, but understand the complete message that is being said. So I once sat in a meeting with a customer where we were doing a project for them, and the project was not going well. And it took this person told me this over the course of an hour and repeatedly said what was going on. Never raised their voice to me once, was always very polite, very considered about what they said, but for an hour just repeatedly told me how bad this project was going. And so there was nothing about the words, nothing about the tone of voice or anything, but the overall message came out loud and clear that they were not happy with that. And as I say, that's more than just the words. Okay, so you've got to pay attention to the other person very carefully. You can't allow yourself to be distracted by what else is going on. I find quite often I will look around at someone's office and see what else is in that room. What else can I learn from looking at posters on the wall, for example? But all of that's distracting me from what it is that they're saying. And then I'm not hearing all of that, right? You don't want to spend time forming counter arguments in your head. Listen to what they've got to say, then think about it before you respond. You can't allow yourself to get bored, right? Sometimes people will talk on and on and on about lots of things, and you allow yourself to get distracted and lose focus because it's not that interesting. Again, you've got to pay attention to what it is that's being said so that you hear all of it, okay? So how do we go about doing that, right? So you've got to obviously give them your complete attention, right? Look at them, try and blank out any other distracting thoughts. say, don't think of answers until they've finished speaking. Because again, they may say 3 or 4 things and you don't know which one you want to talk about until it's finished. Try and avoid being distracted by other things. So people going past the window, other things that are going on around, and look at their body language. What is it? What are they telling you from the way they're sitting or standing or whatever? What is that helping to reinforce? What message is coming through from that? Okay, so you pay attention, you do all of those things. But then it's also important that you actually go back to them and demonstrate that you're doing all those things. So you've got to show them that you're listening. So you want to maintain eye contact with them. Don't look all around them. Look at them so that they know that they're being listened to. Nod, smile, sort of encourage them to carry on speaking. Think about your posture. Just before this all started, I got sent a bunch of photographs from an exhibition last week where people had taken my picture. And in almost all of them, my head is to the side whilst I'm listening to people speaking, right? And I started to realize that is something that we do when we're listening to people, right? So think about how you're standing and how your body is reflecting the fact that you're listening. Try to mirror the speaker. Right. So if they're behaving in a certain way, try and look back and behave in the same way that they are. Right. Encourage them to continue with sort of yeses, nos, and yes, so that they continue to speak. And obviously try not to fidget, try not to be distracting in what you do. Okay. We also then need to provide some feedback to them. Right. Now, there's 2 reasons why we provide feedback. One is to say, yes, I've heard what you're saying. The other is to actually help you to remember what it is that they've said. Because when you go back and say, yes, so what you've just said is, let me put that in my own words. It helps you to remember it more effectively because you've now said it yourself. You've not just listened to it. So it really helps to actually go back and say, so this is what you've just said. I think this is what you mean. Is that right? And such like. So you're summarizing what they've said every so often. You're clarifying it if you need to, right? Because that's another important thing. If they've said something that you don't quite understand, ask them why they've said it. Ask them what else, if you need some evidence for it, like, why do they believe that? What is it that they're saying that makes them say that? So that you get the whole picture from them. Okay. Try not to interrupt. It can be difficult if they say something that's particularly provocative, maybe. But try not to interrupt with people once they are talking. So let them finish. If they do pause, you don't need to jump in and fill that pause. If it goes on for a while, if it's clear that they've stopped speaking, then yes, it's time for you to speak. But I'd be more inclined to sort of, if there's just a short pause, you might just say, can you tell me a bit more about that? And give them encouragement to carry on speaking. And then finally, when you are finished, summarize what you've heard, provide the information that's requested, being open and honest about it all. And sometimes it depends what it is that you're talking about, but be careful about expressing opinions. Sometimes it's facts that are more important in these circumstances rather than opinions. And if you're interested, there is another Harvard Business article about what great listeners do. And it's very much about seeing the interaction as a conversation rather than a question and answer session. So trying to make sure that people will, you are involved in it. It's not simply just them talking and you asking another question. But the more you actually interact with them, the better it's going to be, and the better overall the conversation is going to be. So you'll get that link when you get the slides. Again, that's another paper that's worth reading. Okay. Any questions or comments about listening before I move on? Right. Okay. So as I say, there are times when we're trying to talk about something and our customer's going to object for some reasons. Now, particularly towards the end of the sales cycle, when we think we're getting close to actually making the sale, an objection can be the most frustrating thing because it feels like you're being pushed back in the sales process, and you're not as close to finishing as you want to, as you thought you might have been, and it can be really frustrating. So, but it's actually really important to understand that objections are not always that the customer doesn't like what you've said or doesn't like what you've done or whatever. It's generally coming from a lack of information. They're trying to understand more about what it is that you're talking about. And quite often it comes from, they've gone from an abstract view of, here's a product that might be interesting, to actually, how are we going to go and deal with this product in our office, in our workflows? How is it going to add value to us? And how are we going to deal with it? All right. And you may not have answered those questions before this point. And so their objection is really just more of a request for information than anything else. So it is important that when they come, right, that you handle them appropriately. As I say, they are generally a request for more information rather than I really don't like this. Okay. So there's 4 steps to handling an objection. Pause is the first thing. So don't jump in, right? Wait till the customer is finished. Understand thoroughly, respond thoughtfully, and then ensure that you've dealt with it. So we'll just talk about each of those. Okay, so pause, take your time, right? Again, it can be really frustrating to have somebody object to something where you think you're close to getting a deal or where you think you've given this information in the past, right? And so it feels like it's a personal slight to you, right? So it's not. You've got to remember, take your time, take a breath, then answer, right? Thank them for raising the problem, okay? Acknowledge that it could be a problem. Acknowledge that you care about the fact that they care about it, okay? Understand thoroughly, right? So why are they asking the question? What is it that they're thinking? So again, you've got to go back to asking open questions. Ask questions that truly make you understand why they are asking the question. And again, repeat it back to the customer in your own words to make sure that you have understood what it is that they're saying. Then depending on what it is, you have to respond thoughtfully, right? So maybe it's information that you haven't provided them with. Maybe it's something that you're not quite sure. Maybe it's something that's not actually that important. But try to answer it in an appropriate way such that you are, respecting their ideas and their problems with what it is that they've raised. So that, again, you have got you're going to have a happy customer at the end. It can, an objection can cause problems for both sides. You want to try and diffuse that problem if you can. And then before you move on, make sure that they're happy and that you've dealt with the objection. Is there anything else that I can deal with? Okay. And again, I think I've said it in a previous webinar, one of the most important questions that you can ever ask is there anything else that I need to know? Are there any other objections? Are there any other reasons why we can't proceed or something like that, right? So make sure that there's nothing else blocking the progress to the next step so that both sides are comfortable and happy with where we're going, okay? So that's objections. Any questions? I'll pause it in a second.
I have a question.
Okay.
I want to understand, especially when you're closing a meeting, many times it happens that the conversion percentage is very less, right? Like hardly 1% or 5% of your meetings are successful and you eventually end up getting business from them.
Yeah.
So, and you get to know in that first meeting that maybe it'll not work out for both parties. And this is going to go towards a negative decision from the customer.
Yeah.
In that case, how do we close so that we have some hope for any future business for that matter.
Okay, so that's where you have your secondary objective, right? So what you don't want to do is walk away and never talk to that customer ever again, right? You want to be able to maintain a relationship with them. You may not be the right product for them today, but if you've done your research and your needs analysis well enough, it may well be at some point in the future. So you'll get agreement that you can put them on a mailing list, or you'll get agreement that you'll have another meeting in 6 months' time, or that at least you'll stay in touch with them and send them information every so often. So get agreement that you can continue to contact them, right? So and then that way you can continually ask, go back in 6 months, 12 months, whatever you think is appropriate to say. Is it can we have another meeting? Can we see what's changed? Or maybe they're going to a trade show or something. You can arrange to meet them there and have a non-salesy conversation with them. So focus on building the relationship such that when they do get to the point that they need what you've got, your relationship is there, and there's not been a huge, big, long gap in between.
Right.
Okay.
Because I've seen certain customers coming around after 2 years, after 3 years as well.
Yes.
And,
Yes. Yes. Now I've got any number of customers that I have talked to, and I just keep on in contact with them, and eventually they will come to the point where they'll buy. But yeah, you've got to give them that time sometimes to come to that realization.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. No worries. Any other questions?
Yes, just a question. I mean, now that all the meetings are online,
Yes.
keeping this nurturing stuff is much difficult.
Yes.
No?
Yes.
And I didn't find a way, no, to solve the issue.
No, it's very difficult. I would be, try to have the first meetings if you can in person, such that you can build that relationship and you can see what people's general body language is like, see the way they behave, get familiar with them. Then I think online meetings are reasonably okay to have, because you can have a reasonable conversation because you know that person reasonably well.
Yeah.
If you can't, again, I would try to have time for chit chat. There's a tendency with online meetings that we all turn up right on time and we don't really have that non-work conversation that you have with people. I went into a meeting yesterday. It was with a non-British person who's living in the UK, and they were thinking about trying to get citizenship. So we were talking about the tests that they have to take in order to get citizenship.
Yeah.
So I learn about what they are doing. I express interest in what they're doing. I now know that the next time I see them, I've got something else I can ask them about.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So that building up that picture of who they are and what's interesting to them is really actually quite important. And the more that you can do that, the better. So that you can you've got that. And so I would, if you're having the meeting online, try to have that chit chat if you can. Obviously, if there's a number of people in the meeting, it's difficult to do.
Yes,
because you haven't got that one-to-one that you would have. But yeah, if you can. Hey. How you doing?
It's not hearing you.
No, it's not hearing. Yes. So yeah, so that's what I would try to do. It's not as easy online for sure. In person is much better, but you can't always get that, unfortunately.
No, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I will stop sharing and